being equal, we may have a little bit of light relief from 12 o'clock today with Mistrio. We shall no doubt be casting an eye over Jeremy Corbyn's travails, and I suspect the powerful argument that from where the Labour leader is sitting, the resignation of Tom Watson is not necessarily bad news on the scale that many of the newspapers would have you believe this morning, but I shall be finding out what you think about that. All of which follows a visit from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Now, because we're in an election period, Mr. Khan is a guest on my show as opposed to a sort of ersatz presenter in his own right. But apart from that, the format remains exactly the same. And the invitation to you is to ring in and put to him whichever question you please. 0345 6060 973 is, as ever, the number you need. And we will kick off imminently. I should begin, Sadiq Khan, with questions about Tom Watson's resignation, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, day one of an election campaign. It's almost as if he designed it to inflict maximum damage upon the leader, while
James,
simultaneously claiming that it was a personal, not political decision.
Morning. I'm not sure that's right. Let me declare an interest. Tom is a friend. He's been a friend for a long time. I think it genuinely is for personal reasons. I think genuinely...
Come on, the timing then.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's right. And what I'm hoping, Tom will speak more about this over the coming days, and you'll see him campaigning across the country for a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn. What's clear is, Tom's 52 years old. He wants to make changes in his personal life and the job that he does, and I wish him all the best. I sent him a text last night, and I'm sure we'll see more of Tom Watson in public life. But as well as some of the exciting projects he wants to do going forward. And
Ian Austin, it's slightly harder to... what was in the text that you sent him?
Yeah.
Just good to Tom Watson, just good wishes, anything else?
I'll keep it private if you don't mind.
No, that's absolutely fine.
But with Ian Austin, again, clear interest...
Just for people who aren't aware, Ian Austin has urged previous Labour voters to vote Conservative in the coming election, and he won't be standing in his another West Midlands seat, actually.
Yeah, Ian for some time has expressed big concerns about the Labour Party led by Jeremy Corbyn. Where I agree with Ian Austin is his concerns about the Labour Party's failure to tackle quickly enough concerns around anti-Semitism, not just perceptions, but in reality, there are examples of Labour Party members who have said things that are clearly anti-Semitic, and they've been members of the party for far too long after saying that. And I think Ian's right. We've acted too slow as a party to deal with that. Again, I wish Ian all the best. I disagree with Ian Austin, by the way, about his advice to vote for Boris Johnson. I think the idea of a Brexit-backing Prime Minister who's going to continue his love of austerity is bad for our country. And what I'd say to people is look at the various candidates standing in your patch and look at our manifesto when it's published. Look at our track record versus the Conservative parties and vote Labour.
No mention of specific constituencies today. That's a caution to myself, my guest, and indeed my callers. Speaking of which, shall we take the first one?
Good morning. The first call is from North Kent. It's from Joe. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning.
Good to speak to you, Joe. What's your question?
My first question relates to Grenfell.
Uh-huh.
I saw your letter yesterday to the Mayor. I was a bit surprised at how last minute that was, first of all. But my question is, what in one sentence, what solid proposal or change or, direction have you given that would either prevent or help prevent another Grenfell happening tomorrow in London?
Well, already I can give you a number of examples. Through City Hall funding, I've approved funding of buying new drones, aerial appliances, improved training, smoke hoods, alarms that let firefighters know when a building's going to collapse, and other things that I've invested in from City Hall. You'll be aware, Joe, that in the 8 years before I became mayor, the previous mayor made massive cuts to fire appliances, to fire stations, to firefighters. I've done the opposite and invested in our fire service. Is that one sentence long enough for you, Joe?
It's long enough, and let's hope it's effective enough.
My next
question would relate to, I saw that you've removed Ryden from the suppliers list because there were some issues around them. I wonder what your thoughts were on AECOM, given the fact that...
Steady. I don't know if you've... Yeah, okay, carry on.
AECOM were appointed by Kensington and Chelsea Council to undertake the soil testing in this area for contamination. And the week before the soil testing was undertaken, Kensington and Chelsea removed all of the topsoil and replaced it. This is actually noted in the Scientific Advisory Group minutes for June of this year. And there were objections from panel members at the time. Now, I mean, if a company is coming in supposedly in good faith to undertake tests like that, do you think it's really fair that, you know, the person who commissions them and the company that undertakes them are sort of involved in a process where such gaming occurs? And, you know, given the fact that that company is lined up to be doing quite a bit of the Ladbroke Grove Gasworks redevelopment and the Old Oak Zone redevelopment works for the Elizabeth line, do you think it's really fair that they should be appointed to such high-profile projects?
Well, let me just unpackage the various points you've made in your very long question with respect. I made a decision, City Hall made a decision in 2018 because of serious concerns around the role of Ryden in the Grenfell Tower fire. And you'll be aware there are a number of concerns about the Grenfell Tower fire. The construction of the tower, the refurbishment of the tower.
Well, the construction of the tower was fine,
Joe,
with respect.
I just want to hear him answer, because as the question was very long, so I don't want to overcomplicate it.
So the construction, the refurbishment, the maintenance and the emergency response. Now, there are big concerns expressed around Ryden in relation to their role in the cladding that was installed in Grenfell Tower fire. And so I made a decision that it was in the public interest to suspend Ryden being able to get any contracts that I award. If there are any other companies about which there are concerns, and by the way, this is subject to what phase 2 of the inquiry says, of course I will look into that. So, Joe, if there's contractors that you think I in City Hall may contract with, please get in touch with my office and we'll look into that. I simply can't be held accountable for what the Royal Borough of KNC does. You'll be aware of my public criticism, and by the way, it's been private as well, of that council. And I think that council is fit for purpose, and I think phase 2 of the inquiry will show they've let people down.
What did you think of Jacob Rees-Mogg's comments this week?
Well, I don't listen to the LBC breakfast show, but I heard about the comments later on. It's just too right-wing.
It's quite good.
It's too right-wing for me. But what was quite clear from what this man said was he just put aside the lack of empathy, put aside the lack of understanding the facts around Grenfell Tower and what happened. It was the lack of humanity and the arrogance and the detachment of what happened. The idea that those 72 people who perished, the idea that those bereaved survivors who in the end fled somehow lacked common sense. And I think you'll see in phase 2 more examples, phase 2 of the inquiry, more examples of this arrogant, and not just from politicians from central government, but from the council, from contractors and from others. And I want you just to put yourself in the feet, in the shoes of a bereaved family member of a survivor. And by the way, their lives will never be the same again when you have one of the most senior members of this government basically saying that he has common sense to ignore the advice of professional skilled firefighters and leave the building, and those who stayed and perished lack that common sense.
You mentioned senior members of the government. They have apologised. James Cleverly, the Tory chairman, yesterday acknowledged huge distress had been caused by Jacob Rees-Mogg's remarks and said that the minister was right to apologise.
Look, if an apology is genuine and sincere, then I think that's fine. What I think the public don't like is politicians who apologise because they've been advised by spin doctors or advisors to do so, because it doesn't look good. I think you'll see during this campaign, James, more examples of arrogance and detachment from politicians from the ruling party. What I'd hope is...
Well, we'll probably see plenty of examples from all parties of arrogance and detachment if we're talking about politicians.
But in this particular case, I mean, you can give examples of arrogance throughout. In the case of the biggest single, catastrophe we've seen in, many, many decades, if not the last century, that sort of arrogance after the publication of phase 1 of the public inquiry, frankly, beggars belief.
What did you take from that publication?
A number of things. I mean, firstly, a big tribute to the bereaved families, the survivors, the local community for their campaigning effort at a time when they should be grieving. They've been campaigning. It's clear there were institutional failures of the London Fire Brigade, which meant their response wasn't good enough. The context is, though, every single firefighter who attended that fire did so with the intention of saving lives. Lessons to learn for the police, the ambulance service, and many others. My own personal view, by the way, is I think the inquiry was done the wrong way around. What I'd like to have seen was phase 2 before phase 1. What do I mean? I'd like to have seen a judge look into the construction, the refurbishment, and the maintenance before the emergency response, because my concern is that the big questions that local residents and families haven't yet been answered, and it'll be at least 2 years before they're properly addressed.
The Conservative mayoral candidate Sean Bailey has called for the Chief Fire Officer, Danny Cotton, to resign. Do you think she should?
Well, I've also been contacted by local families, and I'll be meeting them next week to discuss their concerns. Look, she's going anyway. We've started recruiting for a new fire commissioner. But more importantly, over the last 2 years, she started to make sure the fire service addresses, before the publication of the inquiry, changes to make sure the fire service can respond, God forbid, if there's a fire like this in the future. What's clear is that we need to have a change in relation to not just the training, not just in relation to the equipment, but in relation to the response of emergency services to a fire like this. The bad news is there are still high-rise buildings in London, more than 200, which have cladding and other materials that is an accelerant. Across the country, more than 400. So the big concern the Commissioner has, and many firefighters have, is how they would respond to a similar fire. And that's one of the things that the Commissioner is helping me do, is to make sure the London Fire Brigade is as ready as it can be to respond to fires like this.
She has, of course, apologised subsequently, but
what she said was wrong. No, look,
Doreen Lawrence is. I'm thinking of now, not Danny Cotton. Danny Cotton has also apologised for
she's right to do so.
For suggesting that she wouldn't do anything differently. But Dame Doreen Lawrence, of course, suggested that response had in some way been diminished or diluted by racism. That was off the scale ridiculous, wasn't it?
Well, to give Doreen credit, and this is a good example of the humility of the woman, Doreen then spent some time with firefighters over the next day. And Doreen deserves massive credit for saying, you know what, I've now spoken to firefighters, I've met with them, I was wrong, and I apologise. And, you know, honestly, I'm humbled when I spend time with firefighters or police officers. I mean, genuinely, I mean, it sounds like a platitude or a cliche, but literally, these men and women ran into a burning building without equipment, without apparatus, to try and save people's lives. Every single person who attended did so with that intention. But you'll be clear from the public inquiry phase 1 report, the conclusion reached by the judge was, but for the stay put advice, more people may have survived. And that is, you know, that will be with these firefighters forever. Okay, the next caller, thank you, Joe, for your call. The next caller is from Woolwich, and it's Terry. Good morning, Terry.
Good morning, gents. I'd like to ask Sadiq, we see the stabbings week in, week out. What's going to change with this?
Stabbings?
Yeah, when you say change with this, you mean how are we going to reduce violent crime and stabbings?
Yep.
Well, Terry, thanks for your question. You're right. I mean, we do see too many stabbings across our city. We have made some progress over the last couple of years. I'll give you some examples of the progress, then I'll give you some examples of what we need to do going forward. So some examples of the progress are, we've seen over the last year about a 15% reduction in the numbers of under 25s who have been stabbed. We've seen a reduction in the numbers of homicides of under 25s and a reduction in the number of homicides that are gang-related. Still not good enough. We've still got to do far, far more. So what we've done from City Hall is we've got a new approach, which is called a public health approach. We've set up in London England's first violence reduction units. That means not just the police, but also councils, schools, pupil referral units, social services, civic society and others working together to prevent somebody getting involved in a criminal gang or carrying the knife in the first place. The best way to reduce violent crime is to stop it occurring in the first place. So prevention as well as enforcement. And also from City Hall, Terry, we've set up something called the Violent Crime Task Force. And this is police officers working incredibly hard, a specialist team, Terry, and they target those parts of London where there's the highest violent crime. And what they've done, just this one team, by the way, so put aside what the mainstream police do is, other members of the police service, the Violent Crime Task Force, since they've been set up, have taken off our streets more than 2,000 knives, guns, offensive weapons, made more than 7,000 arrests leading to charges. And so they are starting to make progress, but it'd be a lot easier, Terry, if we had more police officers. And so over the last 9 years, we've lost 3,500 officers, 3,500 community support officers, thousands of police staff. We from City Hall are trying to fill the massive hole left by these cuts. What we need, though, is a U-turn from the government so we can have more police on our streets. It's really important.
There was an astonishing thread on Twitter yesterday. It was by the son of a famous person, which is why it probably got some traction. And it just described he was driving through Hammersmith. Someone stopped in front of him on a bike, one of the Boris bikes, abandoned the bike, so he stopped the traffic, and then just had a sort of chase, pulled out a knife. Another teenager turned up with a knife. They chased each other around for 3 or 4 minutes, and then it petered out, and he sort of laughingly got back on his bike and cycled off. And it just, I mention it only because it brought home to those of us who are thankfully not exposed to this sort of thing directly on a daily basis just how casual and commonplace knife use has become. And that's got nothing to do with policing. This is a cultural issue that has grown during your mayoralty. It's become even more commonplace, even more casual just to carry a knife as a young Londoner. And it happens in other cities, but you're only mayor of this one.
So we've got data which shows actually the increase in serious youth violence began in 2012. The increase in violent crime began in 2014 across the country. One of the reasons why I deliberately answered Terry's question, a very good question and very important question, dealt with prevention is we shouldn't pretend that the police can arrest themselves out of this problem. It's got to be prevention as well, deterrence as well. So, for example, why does an 11-year-old leave home with a knife? Why does a 13-year-old join a criminal gang? What is the sense of belonging they feel they have with a criminal gang? So, for example, last week, Terry, I announced additional funding to help schools reduce the number of school exclusions there are. Often hard-pressed teachers have got no choice but to exclude a disruptive child. Question, can we not try and keep that child in the school and support them before they get to the stage where they've got to be excluded? 2 weeks ago, I announced funding for youth workers in A&Es. Why is that important? Because all the evidence is that somebody who goes into hospital for a, inverted commas, less serious stabbing will later on come in for a more serious stabbing and could ultimately be the victim of a homicide. So if you can at an early stage get a youth worker in to turn them around during that reachable moment, that teachable moment, it hopefully avoids them become the victim later on. But also the really startling fact is 71% of those arrested and charged for murder and manslaughter, 71% have themselves been the victim of a knife crime. So we're doing these things because you're right, James. There's things happened in our society where people think it's okay, it's cool, it's the right thing to do to carry a knife.
It's 21 after 10. I'll introduce the next caller. But before that, a few people are unhappy with your difference in tone when commenting on Jacob Rees-Mogg's apology over his comments on Grenfell and Doreen Lawrence's apology for her comments on Grenfell. Why would you accept one wholeheartedly while display a degree of cynicism about the other?
Well, I know Doreen Lawrence, and I've known her for many years, and I've got to be honest, she's a mentor to me and a role model and a hero. Jacob Rees-Mogg isn't.
Well, you've answered the question. Gary is in Vauxhall. Gary, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, Gary.
Thanks for. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to come on again. I have spoken to you on this programme before. Before I could get to my questions, you cut me off.
Is that me or James?
You. James has always been very passionate in his support of new Covent Garden fruit markets. Unfortunately, we can't say the same with the Mayor of London.
Right.
So what I'd like to know is why you're showing no interest in the peril of the largest wholesale fruit and vegetable market in Great Britain. You are a local boy. You do know that there's 2,500 jobs on site, which is multiplied by up to about 25,000 jobs within a 4-mile radius. And you also know that the tenants of this market have had to take action, to take high court action against DEFRA themselves because they're destroying the market. And how do you know? Because I've written to you several times where you said you'd come and visit and you haven't. And several members of the Labour Party and Conservative Party have also written to you, including Marcia de Cova, the MP for Battersea, and still you don't take any interest. We are now in a position where we've got to go to court next year, which is going to cost the SMEs, the small businesses, £4 million to fight the government because they're destroying our market for 5,000 flats and losing all the local jobs. Why will you take no interest? Why will you not come and meet me, Gary Marshall, chairman of New Covent Garden Tenants Association, and support what you pretend to always do, local jobs and low-cost housing?
Well, Gary, let me just do the various points that you raised. So your anger is at me, the Mayor of London, because of a decision taken by central government and the previous mayor and the council in giving planning permission for a development that will cause damage to New Covent Garden market. Now, I appreciate that I'm accountable and responsible for many things, but even you would have to admit that you can't point the finger at me for decisions taken by the council and the previous mayor and by DEFRA.
Come back,
I can
Gary.
point my finger at you for your lack of interest
I know you are.
in not coming down and speaking to us and supporting, which you say you do, local jobs. I appreciate that this planning application was passed in 2008, but what has simultaneously happened since then is you, in particular, as the Mayor of London, have not even taken the time to come down and speak to the local people that you should be representing. And we don't want you to change things. We want what you promised, which we have not had, your support. We are now in a position where the biggest market in Great Britain, which has got a 300-year history, will no longer be there. In 3 years' time, it will be gone, and everybody will say, why didn't I do something about it? And James can speak to his friend where he buys his local fruit and veg, because it's going to be a very short thing. We work while everybody else sleeps. We feed London and the South East counties. We will be missed. And apart from the problems of Brexit, which we will not go into, you could come down and support us. You could listen to how you could help. You haven't even bothered.
It sounds like they just want a bit of representation, even if you can't affect a change to what's on the horizon.
And a lot of people from City Hall have spoken to and listened to not just those in charge of the tenants, but others as well.
Just pledge now to go and see them.
Well, what I'll do is I'll speak to the team at City Hall. I mean, I think. Look, Gary Marshall's representation of the help given by City Hall is one-sided, but also I think he has accepted that I can't be blamed for this one. What I will do is make sure City Hall continues to engage with those involved in New Covent Garden.
Why can't you just say, I'll come and see you for a cup of tea next Tuesday?
Well, because the key thing is we've got to make sure that we help as much as we can all businesses across our city. But what we can't do is be held responsible for policies of the previous mayor or central government. And I think what's really important
but he accepts
is to help.
That. He's just looking
eventually,
for
once I pointed this out to him, he accepted this
Okay.
stuff. But that's really important that people accept that and understand who's responsible.
Gary, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do?
James, what I'd like you to do, you can obviously speak to, your friend, but there's 175 companies based in New Covent Garden Market that are all come from, set up by their families, set up by their, on the 31st of March, the landlord is going to throw out 9 companies, which represents nearly £100 million at a turnover and 300 jobs. All I want the mayor to do is be courteous enough to get up. We're up early. He hasn't got to cancel another appointment. Come with him, James. Come to Covent Garden. We're open from midnight. We're there all through the morning. Come at 5 o'clock. Have a cup of tea. Have a walk round. Talk to local people and understand. Show you if the last mayor was not
to be clear, Gary.
Prove you are.
To be clear, what I'm hearing, and I want to make sure I've got this right, is that you accept that there's not a great deal he can do, but you just feel abandoned and ignored.
Who knows what he can do if he don't try?
It's a fair point again.
Well, City Hall isn't just one person, the mayor. City Hall is a number of people who work incredibly hard, and I'll make sure my team looks into the points Mr. Marshall's raised this morning to see if there are additional things we can do.
I promise you that.
I'm sure he will, but at least this time he's been honest about where the responsibility lies. And so, that's really important, that one of the roles, I think, of politicians is to inform and educate. And I think we've got, after this exchange between me and Mr. Marshall, where the responsibility lies, and I'll see if there's anything City Hall can do, bearing in mind these decisions weren't taken by my administration, but by a previous one, bearing in mind it's central government that's responsible and the landlord, not the Mayor of London.
But the previous administration can't offer any comfort or concern, only the current administration
Well, sure,
can.
that's why what I've undertaken to do is to ask my officials to look into whether there's any additional help we can give to Mr. Marshall.
27 minutes after 10, Gary, don't leave me out of the loop with whatever transpires. Just to mention, you were criticising Conservatives earlier and suggesting they would continue austerity. Sajid Javid, currently giving a speech, insists that they would end it. So putting that out there by way. No, it's not an invitation for you to come back. I'm putting it out there for
we need balance. Well, I need to respond to that because that's
no, you
needs to be balanced.
You said they're going to carry it on.
Well, Theresa May said it. Theresa May said it ended 2 years ago. Theresa May said it ended 2 years ago. Whereas this austerity?
She's not running.
Well, exactly. A leopard doesn't change its spots, and Sajid's the same party as Theresa May. So trust this party by its record over the last 9 years.
All right. And at 10:28, Fred is in Ilford. Fred, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Morning, Fred.
Good morning, Mr. Khan. I was wondering why you spent 20 million on rubbish ferries.
This is a story about the Woolwich ferries being plagued with continuous technical problems, which have even, I think, prompted some staff to go on strike, as reported this very morning by LBC's Rachel Venables.
Fred, you're right. The ferries aren't good enough, and so the ferries were supposed to be good enough. And they haven't been good enough. There's been all sorts of problems. I don't want to call them teething problems because that trivialises the problems they've been. The manufacturers are trying to rectify the problems. Since August, there's been a big improvement in the running of the operation. The contract for the company that runs the ferry comes up for renewal very shortly. And one of the things I'll be looking into, and I do this when it comes to all contracts, is to see whether we TfL should be running the ferry rather than the private company. But Fred, you're right, and hands up, we've dropped the ball on this.
Why?
We should have known. I think what happened was the ferries, when they were ordered, they're first of its kind. They're energy efficient. They're hybrid, but there's been all sorts of, what in my view, are basic problems in relation to where they log onto one side of the river versus the other, mechanical problems. And Fred, TfL, we've got to put our hands up and say these problems should have been sorted out in the factory, not in the River Thames. Thousands of people have been inconvenienced. You mentioned the staff, James. The staff I care about, of course, but I care as much about those who've been inconvenienced. And Fred, we think we've turned the corner. TfL have got a top team of engineers working on this. And can I just also apologise to all those affected by this who've had a huge disruption. And hopefully, Fred, we've turned the corner on this.
How bad is it, Fred?
I went with a friend who's a transport enthusiast, and he was in raptures about the old ferries and was saying, "Oh, it's a shame we can't. He's a bit too doddery to go across." I said, "Let's go across," and it took longer to dock.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Than it did to cross the river. About double the time.
Fred, when did you go on it? When was it? How recently?
It was. At the beginning of the summer.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense, Fred. Yeah.
Okay.
Just looking at it, you could see it was an idiotic design. Magnets, not enough staff.
But the mayor is telling us things have improved.
Fred, can I just say I think nothing you said I can hand on heart disagree with. I mean, it's as simple as Fred's right. It's I call it magnets as well because I'm not that technically knowledgeable, but the magnets won't work in relation to docking. Fred, we think we've turned the corner in relation to the ferry. But can I explain? The previous ferries were diesel and were very polluted, and we're trying to clean up the River Thames. And one way of doing that is by having hybrid ferries, but they've got to work. And so since August, I've been told the reliability is now about 95%. It needs to get to 100%. But the staff work incredibly hard, and the users have received a poor service, and I apologise.
Fred, let me know if things haven't got better. 10:31 is the time. We're hearing of some Labour candidates in the capital who are omitting Jeremy Corbyn from their campaign literature. Amid concerns that he's not going down very well on the doorstep, and some of them have requested endorsements instead from you. How do you feel about candidates using your face instead of Jeremy Corbyn's?
Well, without naming seats for obvious reasons, because of broadcast rules. I mean, I'm campaigning all across London. I'm the Mayor of London. I'm the Labour Mayor of London. So it's hardly surprising, I would hope, for candidates to want to, use me and help them win their seats.
But that's not what I asked. It's using you instead of use. They could easily use both. They could easily use him and not you, but they've decided not to use him and to use you. That's not great for party unity or for the party offering.
I mean, it's a question to ask the candidates about.
I'm asking how you feel about it. I can't ask them that.
Well, obviously, I feel great about helping Labour candidates become MPs.
How do you feel about London Labour MPs on the doorstep thinking that the leader of their own party could do more harm than good on campaign literature?
I'm not sure if that's right, though. I mean, so without naming seats for obvious reasons,
yes.
I mean, Jeremy Corbyn has been across London, has been at rallies across London. The launch of the Labour Party campaign was in a London seat, a seat we gained in 2017. Jeremy Corbyn was back in South London for a seat which we're hoping to take off the Conservatives. So it's untrue to suggest that Jeremy Corbyn isn't campaigning in London, but not unreasonably, he's the national leader, and a lot of his time is spent outside of London. And so, me as the Labour Mayor of London, I'm helping colleagues, friends, Labour candidates try and win their seats when the election is on December the 12th.
I was hoping a caller would bring this up, but they haven't, so I will. Scotland Yard facing multi-million pound payouts to Extinction Rebellion activists after the High Court ruled that banning their demos last month was illegal. Where do you stand on this? What do you think of the ruling?
Well, I think most of your listeners know my views in relation to the decision taken when it was taken. There's two things to say. Firstly, I've said for some time there is a climate emergency. People should have the right to protest, one of the joys of a democracy, but that they should do so peacefully and lawfully. This was an operational decision about which I wasn't consulted, and I expressed my concerns at the time.
So it stops with in Cressida Dick's office, does it? This chain of responsibility.
It's an operational decision that stops with the Met Police Service.
You're right.
I expressed concerns at the time. The High Court's judgment is very, very useful, because now the police are clear what the law is, and the police will make sure lessons are learned going forward.
And yet, that's taxpayers' money, isn't it, if there is a big payout here?
Well, the two things I'd say to this is, firstly, I've got nothing but respect for under-resourced, overstretched police. On this occasion, they were on the wrong side of the law. But at the same time, a message to anybody who wants to protest in our wonderful city is, it's one of the joys of democracy, but please do it peacefully and lawfully. If you want to protest, coordinate and liaise with the police to make sure they can facilitate your protest. We have more than 3,000 protests every year. And what the police try and do is make sure the law is upheld, but also our city functions.
I'd take another call now from Gersharan, who's in Southall. Gersharan, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Yeah, I'd just like to ask the Mayor that our protest for a genocide which is happening in Kashmir was banned by the Mayor himself outside the Indian High Commission. I'd just like to know the reasons, and as Justice said...
So we're staying with peaceful protest, and this is one that you chose to close down?
Well, it's really important to get the facts right.
Of course.
I haven't got the power to ban marches, but what the police do is have the power to impose conditions on a march or a protest. And one of the conditions that the Met Police Service attached to this demonstration, which I fully support, by the way, is for people not to protest on the day of Diwali outside the Indian High Commission. And the context is that the Indian High Commission and previous protests has had windows smashed. Staff have felt very scared, but also it's the day of Diwali. So the police imposed a condition that you can protest, you can march, but please do it a better way from the Indian High Commission, which the protesters did.
Gersharan, would you like to come back on that?
The thing is, I think what Mayor Khan has to realise that he's inadvertently backing genocide in Kashmir, because if he's telling me as a Sikh about Diwali, I think he's very mistaken. And secondly,
just expand on that, would you? Because I want to get my facts right. You were told you could continue to protest, but to just not in the immediate vicinity of the embassy on specific days.
Diwali is not going to be celebrated inside the Indian High Commission. It's going to be celebrated in religious institutions all over the country. So this idea is bogus. And secondly, for Mayor Khan to come up with this kind of nonsense, it shows that he's just playing a political game. But secondly, I think it's very duplicit by the mayor to support one set of protests and to reject the other. And secondly, how can you oppose Donald Trump on one hand and then back, the Indian High Commission, who are literally committing genocide in Kashmir? And as a Sikh, I know more about Diwali than he can know ever.
Well, let me deal with the number of points that have been made by Gersharan. So firstly, the police regularly impose conditions on protests and demonstrations, and I support their right to do so as long as they're lawfully. So, for example, recently I took part in a protest, roughly speaking, 1 million people, to do with a people's vote. The organisers liaised with the police and made sure that the protest was peaceful. For example, the rally ended in Parliament Square. Stephen Yaxley Lennon and his supporters regularly protest. I disagree with them passionately, but the police impose conditions. For example, only between certain hours should they be outside Whitehall. On certain days, they can't go in certain parts of London, and that happens regularly. There are 3,000 protests a year, and it's not unusual for the police to impose conditions. For example, with the Extinction Rebellion, the police imposed conditions. With those protesting against Donald Trump, there were agreements reached between the protesters and the police. There's something unusual about that. In relation to, inverted commas, the genocide, look, that's one of the reasons why the protest wasn't banned, because in a democracy, it's really important that people are allowed to protest. Democracy ain't just voting in elections. It's being able to protest, it's signing petitions, it's lobbying your MPs, it's lobbying the mayor, etc. So the fact that the police, for operational reasons, want to impose conditions to make sure our city runs is not because they've formed a view on any particular protest, because that leads to a conducive run in the city. And in relation to you educating me about Diwali, I was in Trafalgar Square this weekend celebrating Diwali. Unless I'm mistaken, Trafalgar Square isn't a temple, and so yes, it is possible to celebrate Diwali outside of a temple, a gurdwara or a mandir. So look, I'm happy to have a ding-dong with you about protest and human rights, but I think you've got to accept that in a democracy, the police have a really important job to make sure the law is upheld and our city functions. That's what they've tried to do. It doesn't mean they've formed a view on any particular protest.
10:38 is the time. That concludes our time together. A slightly different flavour from usual, given the requirements of broadcasting regulations during an election period. How busy are you going to be between now and December the 12th? Well,
when I'm not doing my day job, being the mayor, I'll be spending my weekends and evenings campaigning for candidates across our city. And I think it's really important. December the 12th is a really important election. I'm hoping the winter nights and the cold days don't lead to a lower turnout. I'm hoping there's a big turnout in this election. And I'd encourage anybody to make sure you're registered to vote and then vote on December the 12th.
Sadiq Khan, many thanks.
Pleasure.
You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Holly Harris is here now with the headlines.
A former Labour MP has urged voters to back Boris Johnson in next month's election.